Hey everybody, Professor Snart here. Happy Monday morning. Okay, so we move into or out of our creative nonfiction section of our course and into poetry, which is sort of like people have a love-hate relationship with it. And I happen to love it. It's sort of my specialization as far as creative writing background goes. And I find it the most interesting to teach for a couple of different reasons. Partly is that poetry is both like really central to our lives and our culture, but also really marginal. Like it has probably the most baggage of any kind of creative writing medium that we could name. Most of it, or well, a good portion of it, I think negative, again, very broadly, culturally speaking, lots of stereotypes surrounding it, who writes it, who reads it, what it's like and what it's all about, what its purpose is. And yeah, for all of that, like ask the average person, do they read poetry? And most people say no, and there's a percentage of those who'd be like, ooh, why are you asking me that? What weird agenda do you have? Which is really unfair, right? So all those stereotypes. And yet, for as marginal as it seems, if you really pay attention, we're surrounded by it, not just in the obvious form of like song lyrics, which is a clear one, but most advertising, especially visual advertising, where you'd see text in a space, whether it's like a magazine page, a billboard, whatever, it's language designed to have an effect arranged on that page space, even if it's virtual. And so that's basically what poetry is. It might not rhyme necessarily. It might not be big and philosophical, but it's still poetry. It's not just lines and lines of prose that we would read. Like advertising doesn't really work that way. So if you think about it, we're sort of surrounded by it all the time. And if you begin looking or thinking about poetry in that way, it's sort of everywhere. Or if we have major sort of private life events like a wedding or a funeral or even birthday, a marriage, any kind of ceremonial type thing like that, or even on the public scale, big like public events, we often turn to poetry to mark that event, to commemorate it, to talk about it. So it's weirdly both marginal and really, really central to our lives. So the other thing that's interesting to me about poetry is that often in teaching poetry, unlike other genres, it's not so much necessarily teaching new information as trying to unteach a whole bunch of preconceptions or misconceptions that people have about poetry that grow out of how we're taught it or how we encounter it as really young kids for reasons of like language learning and just to hear how language can be fun and sort of musical to listen to. But also because so much of the poetry we get is in the form of lyrics. So the first thing is that, right, poetry does not have to rhyme. And in fact, I think often the assumption that a poem should rhyme because it either just has to or it helps it quote unquote flow is kind of misguided, and in fact often does more damage than good to the poem, because we get so consumed with the rhyme at the end of each line that instead of the poem flowing better, it actually gets very choppy, because each line is its own individual thought that just kind of ends, and then we begin to sort of predict that rhyming word, and it's often very simple, right, rhymes that we get to, which is again how we learn it as kids because it's fun to listen to. But it's really not what we necessarily need to be doing now to create poetry. And so the writer often feels more compelled just to get to whatever that rhyming word is, and so we lose sight of being careful with words throughout the line. We kind of invert word order just so we can get to the proper rhyme. Like the rhyme takes over the poem, it doesn't really help it anymore. And that's a pretty blanket statement. And of course rhyme can be really effective, but also often when it's more like what we would call slant rhyme or off rhyme, so words that kind of echo each other or sound a little bit the same, but they're not a perfect rhyme like me, be, and see. Again, those simple monosyllabic perfect rhyme words, they get almost too predictable and sing-songy, and they take over the whole tenor of the poem. So slant rhyme, right, little off rhymes can be good, but also what's called internal rhyme. So instead of always rhyming at the end of a line, if we can create words or sounds within lines that echo one another or sort of call out to one another, that produces a much more interesting and musical sort of fabric in the poem than those really simple end rhymes. So that's one or misconception that people have that I like to unteach, that a poem has to rhyme. It doesn't, and in fact, maybe for our purposes, it shouldn't. You shouldn't feel bound to that. And the other thing is that the baggage that poetry has is that poets are these like weird kind of marginal people who are dark and messed up, and they roll their own cigarettes and wear berets, all that kind of junk. And so this leads people to feel like poetry has to be really grandiose about big philosophical things and big abstract ideas. And so we're reading a poem and the damn thing rhymes, which sucks. And it's about these big, humongous philosophical ideas, and there's no sort of like concrete place for the reader to be. There's no characters, there's no story that unfolds, there's no like setting. We're just sort of floating in the world of poetry. I think it's a misconception that poetry has to be grandiose in that way. We use grandiose language to talk about big and noble things. There is truly a long poetic history of it doing that, but it's certainly not something that we have to now do. So one of the things that you'll notice as we get into our poetry unit here, one of my favorite moments, decontextualize, it's a little on the corny side, but you'll get why I love it here if you read this or watch that part. Quick reading assignment, and then some really interesting stuff about T.S. Eliot, both a poet and a theorizer of poetry. Got some interesting things to say. And a really quick commercial that used to air for HP featuring Gwen Stefani from No Doubt, who in a sort of weird coincidence, but not totally coincidental, I would suggest, because of the way that marketing folks often come out of English programs, really voices a very similar idea about the creative mind as what we find in Eliot's very different, feeling and sounding essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, which is quite long, but I give you some hints of where to look for the stuff that we care about. And then we have a little section from Chicago's own Poetry magazine, which was the original publication of the very famous love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which as a poem we will kind of compare against the ideas expressed in the ad here and in Eliot's own essay to get us thinking about just how the creative poetic mind works. Creative really beyond just poetry, but for our purposes specific to how you sort of build a poem out of really tangible, specific pieces. Okay, so that's sort of our transition or bridge unit. And then you'll notice that in the workshop, I actually have us returning to the rules of poetry, or really the rules of creative writing, because it's so important, I think, to revisit not feeling like we have to write these big, grandiose, let's solve the problems of the universe kinds of poems, and not to get too wrapped up in the emotion of the thing. I know it seems a little counterintuitive, but to make sure that we care about the language, not just this expressive, kind of ranting, whining a little bit, kind of maybe sometimes, but you know what I mean. So that's again part of there's no rule specifically against rhyme, but there is rules about caring about language. And if you're just writing a line to get to the rhyme that you want to get to, that's not really caring about language in the way that we need to. The usual how to post, everyone's doing great with this. And then just off the bottom of my screen, slightly bigger groups than before by maybe 1 or 2 people, but only because poetry tends to be a little bit shorter. So probably you'll have 1 or 2 poems that cover maybe 1 or 2 pages. That's okay given the length. It does present a more challenging assignment for people to comment. So again, you really have to get in there almost on a line-by-line basis, depending on the length of the poem, obviously, but really challenge yourself to get in there with the poem, to ask questions, to celebrate what's going right, to maybe suggest what could change, or you can talk about, I think this poem is about, and a sort of big picture thing, but also to get into that line by line, word by word, what is the sort of what physicality is there in the poem. It's not just big philosophical stuff. And the other thing that we don't really have to comment on in other workshops, but we can here, is how the poem exists on the page, right? How does it use the space of the page as far as line breaks, other kinds of spacing, like between stanzas, or there's sort of paragraphs of a poem. That's one of the things that I really love about poetry versus, say, a short story. Not that language can't be intense in a short story, but most short stories don't actively have a visual component to them. They don't exist as a visual work of art on the space of the page, whereas poems do. So we have this whole other field that we can play with as poets in working with both the text of the poem, but also the poem as a piece of visual art that we can derive impact from by just looking at right on the space of the page. Okay, and so I might as well just wrap it up here since we only have a couple days left. Into the final reflection. Pretty traditional, what did you learn in the course? But I'm inviting and really encouraging people to do a video essay. Sounds a little bit more formal than it is. Really, you're just recording yourself, or even better, recording your screen. So maybe you actually have a visual thing for us to look at, a sort of like bullet point outline, some specific examples, but you can talk us through it a little bit like I'm doing here. You certainly don't have to write a whole essay script and just like read it to us. That kind of defeats the purpose. Set up as a discussion board, so right, you're posting your what did I learn reflection and then replying to a few others. And the one thing that I really want to stress here is that you're really talking about what you learned in the course, not what we learned about. So we learned about the rules of creative writing, but which of those did you really learn, or which of those really struck you? And then how did that express itself in the specifics of your work for the course? It could be the big workshop stuff that we did, but it could just be some of the smaller writing assignments, discussion board assignments. Maybe it's something you saw in someone else's work, so you're actually quoting from somebody else, quoting from the textbook, quoting from whatever. But in short, you want to ground this in specifics, right? Your work, coursework, sort of your engagement with the material in the course. We want at least 3 kind of well-developed ideas here, but again, grounded in examples and specifics. That's why I think the video essay would be great if it were you talking to us, kind of that informal conversational style, but maybe we were looking at a couple of pages you'd prepared that had a little bullet point outline you could return to, keep yourself on track, and you could kind of walk us through, right? You can go through Blackboard here and find the work, all the work that we've done, whether it's discussion boards, the workshop units that we've done, whatever it happens to be. Okay? So as always, if you have questions, concerns, you can be in touch with me. Keep your eye on those due dates as we get right down to the end of our course, especially coming up to our poetry workshop, and then a fairly quick turnaround for that Monday reflection. And certainly you don't have to wait until the official end of the course to start turning that last stuff in. So like I've said before, really a stellar course, great work that people are doing, sort of the perfect class size for what we're trying to accomplish here, and hopefully people are enjoying the experience and also getting something out of it, which is something you can really start thinking about now, since it's what you'll formalize a little bit in that final unit of ours. So if you have questions, concerns, be in touch with me, and I will talk with everybody soon.